Good morning. I'm Sharina Stinson, and I'm trying to fill the shoes of our beloved teacher, Camilla Blaine, who went to be with the Lord in June. This is the Sunset Heights Ladies Bible class. We're studying in Exodus. This is the book that we're using. It is Knowing the Bible. This is Exodus, a 12-week study by Matthew R. Newkirk, with Daniel C. Ortland was the series editor. You can buy these in store at Mardell's Christian Store or order them online. I think you might be able to order them through crossway.org as well. The video is on YouTube. We have a website, and on Facebook. All of those, the handle for YouTube, the website name, and the Facebook page name is sunsetheightsbaptistchurch.com. You can leave comments there, and if you have prayer requests, please just list the name and the need, and we will include those in our opening prayer. So this week we are in Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through chapter 18, verse 27. And this week's study is titled A Journey to Sinai. And ladies, if you have your Bibles, I would like to ask you to look up the extra scriptures that we'll be reading in our study guidebook. Okay, so we'll begin with the printed portion of the weekly study booklet. The place of passage. After God demonstrates his great power through the plagues and finalizes Israel's deliverance at the Red Sea, these chapters record Israel's travels from the Red Sea to the foot of Mount Sinai. Throughout this section, Israel is depicted as faithless and grumbling. Kind of reminds me of us sometimes. Yet God still provides for all their needs. He provides for their physical need of sustenance on multiple occasions. These can be found in Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through chapter 17, verse 7, as well as their spiritual need for leadership in the face of both external, this is chapter 17, 8 through 16, and internal, chapter 18, verses 1 through 27, problems. Ultimately, God sustains his people as he brings them to his mountain, and that's chapter 18, verse 5, in order to confirm his covenant relationship with them. The big picture. On the journey from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai, the Israelites repeatedly reveal their lack of faith, yet God continues to show himself faithful by providing for them. So God's provision of sustenance is chapter 15, verses 22, and that will run through 17, verse 7. So if we, Stephanie, would you start in verse 22 and read?
I undid your thing. Sorry.
That's okay. It plugs right back in, dear.
Oh, good.
So I think the first question is going to deal with verses 22 through 24.
Okay. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. They then went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?"
Okay, so immediately after God delivers Israel through divided water, the parting of the Red Sea, Israel grumbles that they have no drinkable water. However, based on God's deliverance at the Red Sea, Israel should have responded to this seemingly dire circumstance by trusting God rather than grumbling. What does this pattern let me see your book. I wrote over the
Right.
writing, so I can't read it in mine.
Right.
Okay. So this, in other words, deliverance leads to trust despite dire circumstances. So what does this look like for a Christian? And that's our first question. Anybody got an answer?
Well, we're easily disgruntled. We have to be pampered in order for us to be appreciative for some reason. That's just our human nature. But God tries to, He always provides for us. He thinks that you should know that, build on that faith and trust, but it's hard for us to do that.
I also do a comparison to the Israelites and modern day man even, all through the history. And if you know anything about the Bible and even the history books, you come across this repeatedly, where when everything is well, then we're happy and happy to be grateful and all of this stuff. But the minute something goes wrong, what do?
Start whining.
And complaining and expecting more to be done for us than what's being done. And so I think that's probably the answer to the question. It looks much, the Christians today look much like the Israelites of olden times. All right, so then our next question is going to come from Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. Could I get somebody to read that for me?
Then the whole Israelite community left Elim. They came to the desert of Sin. This place was between Elim and Sinai. They came to this place on the 15th day of the second month after they had left Egypt. Then the whole Israelite community grumbled to Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them, "It would have been better if the Lord had killed us in the land of Egypt. There we had meat to eat. We had all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert. You will starve us to death here." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will cause food to fall like rain from the sky. This food will be for all of you. Every day the people must go out and gather what they need for that day. I will do this to see if the people will do what I teach them. On the 6th day of each week, they are to gather twice as much as they gather on the other days. Then they are to prepare it."
Okay, so this passage contains elements of sin, grace, and law. Identify each of these elements in these verses. Sin, grace, and law.
Well, they're complaining, and whining is sin.
Lack of faith.
The graces God provides.
Very good.
And the law is, God says, if you continue to do as I tell you, take what I tell you to take, then I will give it to you.
The law is in his telling them how to gather it, to only gather it that way. Yes, that's true. So which came first, grace or law?
The grace.
Right, yeah. Okay, so our next passage is Exodus 16, verses 6 through 8.
Then Then Moses and Aaron said to all the children of Israel, "At evening you shall know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your complaints against the Lord. But what are we that you complained against us?" Also Moses said, "This shall be seen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord hears your complaints which you make against him. And what are we? Your complaints are not against us, but against the Lord."
Okay. So Moses interprets the people's grumbling against him and Aaron as grumbling against God. What does this suggest about the nature of Moses' leadership over Israel?
He wants the credit to go to God, not to himself.
Anyone else? I think that's the beginning of the answer. The thing is, the people tried to put Moses in God's place. Moses didn't try to take God's place.
Right.
But the people
I
tried
see.
to put
Right.
Moses as the provider, and he
Right.
wasn't, never was, and
Right.
God wanted them to understand that
Exactly.
the provision was from him, not
Moses,
from.
right.
So his leading, the way he was leading them, apparently, is where they got the idea that he was the go-to person rather than God. And in this instance, that's true. We have Jesus as our go-to person.
That's right.
But it's still God that answers our prayers and takes care of us.
Right.
So I see it as Moses, another example of Moses being a Christ-like of the Old Testament, much like Abraham and Adam and Noah.
But the people,
He is the Christ-like type
Right.
in this situation. Okay, so in chapter 16, verses 19 through 20. If someone would read that for me.
Moses said to them, "Don't keep any of it to eat the next day." But some of the people did not listen to Moses. They kept part of it to eat the next morning, but it became full of worms and began to stink. So Moses was angry with these people.
Okay, so how does this then inform our understanding of the people's actions in these two verses?
They just didn't listen. They did it their way anyway.
They saw it as coming from Moses rather than from God. Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah. All right, so Exodus 16 through 26.
This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather it according to each one's need, one omer for another person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. This the children of Israel did so, and gathered some more, some less. So when they measured it by omers, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. Every man had gathered according to each one's needs. And Moses said, "Let no one leave any of it till morning." Notwithstanding, they did not heed Moses, but some of them left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was angry with them.
Okay, when we get down to answering this question, I'm gonna need someone to read Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. So God gives the people instructions for how to gather the manna. They are to gather just enough for each day's consumption and enough on the sixth day for 2 days' consumption. According to Moses' later interpretation of this in Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3, what were these instructions supposed to teach Israel?
Rest on the seventh day.
There's Deuteronomy, what?
Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 3.
8, 2, and 3. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And 3 says, so he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your father know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord.
Okay, so according to that interpretation, what were these instructions supposed to teach Israel? The instructions of how to gather the manna.
That his needs would be met, no more or no less,
Okay.
from the Lord, that's what he had for you. And if that's what you take, then you're going to be taken care of.
I kind of, when we were reading back through it and stuff, a thought struck me that the manna is the bread of life is Jesus Christ.
Oh, yeah.
So
He sure
we
is.
live by the word or the bread of life, but we don't live by bread alone either.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay, so the next scripture is Exodus 17, 1 through 7.
The whole Israelite community left the desert of Sin. They traveled from one place to another as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses. They said, give us water to drink. But Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why are you testing the Lord? But the people were very thirsty for water, so they grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you bring us out of Egypt? Was it to kill us, our children, and our farm animals with thirst? So Moses cried to the Lord, what can I do with these people? They are almost ready to kill me with stones. The Lord said to Moses, go ahead of the people of Israel and take some of the older leaders of Israel with you. Carry with you the walking stick that you used to strike the Nile River. Now go, I will stand in front of you on a rock at Mount Sinai. Hit the rock with the stick, and water will come out of it. Then the people can drink. Moses did these things as the older leaders of Israel watched. Moses named that place Massah because of the Israelites tested the Lord. They asked, is the Lord with us or not? He also named it Meribah because they quarreled.
Okay. So at first glance, this passage seems to be about Israel grumbling for water again. However, verse 7 suggests that a deeper sin problem is the issue here. What's the problem?
They're not trusting in God. They call them.
They're showing a lack of faith.
Mm-hmm.
They're also tempting the Lord. It says so right there.
Mm-hmm.
You don't tempt the Lord. What did Jesus say about tempting the Lord? I think it was when the devil was trying to get him to sin. He was in the wilderness by himself. I think that passage has something about you don't tempt God.
Right.
Or you don't tempt the Father. Okay, so then the second part of this is, what are we to learn from this? And for clarification, it says to see 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. First Corinthians. You're looking in Chronicles.
Oh.
It's in the New Testament. Right after Romans, I think, or Acts. Let's see. Acts, Romans, and then I think First Corinthians.
Not there yet, girl.
There's First Corinthians. You're looking for chapter 10, verses 1 through 6.
Oh, that's Chronicles. Am I not in the right place?
No, Chronicles is in the Old Testament. Corinthians is in the New Testament.
Okay, so I'm not. There's Romans.
Right after Romans, First Corinthians.
Okay.
Your chapter 10 is over there, verses 1 through 6, I think I said.
Okay. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be aware all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses and the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things become our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. That was it, 6.
Yeah,
6.
1 through 6. So, bearing that passage in mind, what are we to learn from Exodus 1 through 7 through the incident of grumbling and complaining about no drink, no water, and then Moses striking the stone and water was there?
Well, that's just the nature of man, and they've always been that way. And even though they've been taught, given the spiritual food and drink, they revert back to their old selves.
You're on the right path there. Yes, it is man's nature, but we're not to be like man.
That's right.
So we need to be satisfied with what God gives us and not grumble and complain about what He has not seen fit to provide us with at this
Right,
moment.
right.
We are to have faith that He will take care of our needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what those two have in common. It's what they point out about one another is that the Israelites should have had the faith to know that God would provide water. I do have a question about whether He was waiting for them to grumble and complain before He did, but I'm not wise enough to answer questions like that.
Right.
God will take care of us, and sometimes not in our time, but in His own time.
Exactly.
Okay, so God's provision of leadership. This is in chapter 17, verses 8 through chapter 18, verse 27. This is the entire rest of the portion of the lesson. So we are now in chapter 17, beginning in verse 8. Israel's battle against okay, I can't say it. Amalek. Thank you. Amalekites.
Amalekites.
Well, not kites. It's just the man. Amalek.
Amalek. Oh, okay.
Amalek contains the last appearance of the staff of God, which was mentioned when Moses struck the water with the staff of God, which was the instrument used to bring the plagues against Egypt, and those are found in chapter 14, verse 17, chapter 20. Chapter 4, verses 17 and 20. Chapter 7, verse 18. Chapter 8, verse 5 and 16. And chapter 9, verse 23. Those were the 10 plagues. At the beginning of each, it involved Moses doing something with the staff. And to part the Red Sea in chapter 14, verse 16, and to bring water from the rock, chapter 17, verse 5. What do these prior uses of the staff suggest about the nature of the battle that ensues? Now, you would have to read about the battle, which is chapter 17, verse 8, and it runs through the rest of our lesson, so it's quite long. Do y'all want to read it or take it in sections?
I can try to read it.
Okay.
I can give it a shot.
All right.
Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim, and Moses said to Joshua, "Choose up some men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hand became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, and Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side, and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. When the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, "Because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." And Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, to whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And the name of the other was Elijah, for he said, "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he had encamped at the mountain of God. Now he had said to Moses, "I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her." So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him, and then they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come down upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. Then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hands of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifice to offer to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. And so it was at the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and all of the people stand before you from morning until evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make knowing the statutes of God and his laws. So Moses' father-in-law said to him, The thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and show them the way in which they must walk, and the work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all of the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. Is that it, or do I do one more?
27.
Okay. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all of the people will also go to their places in peace. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all of Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. And then Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own land.
Okay. Now, thinking about the plagues, the 10 plagues of Egypt, and the role that the staff played in those plagues, and remembering that the staff is actually God's power. So, what do these prior uses of the staff suggest about the nature of the battle that ensues? The battle with the, what was it? Rephidim? No, it was at Rephidim.
Well, I think his rod, the stick, the staff represents God's power.
Yeah. Yeah, but then what does the use of the staff suggest about the nature of the battle that ensues? God's power? Or perhaps
God's in control.
God's sovereign, because he used the
Sovereign.
staff in every one of the plagues. But remember what the plagues were.
Judgment.
They were judgments against the Egyptian people, but against their gods as well.
Yeah.
And God was able to do things that their gods could not counter. They couldn't solve the problem with their gods. They could replicate a problem,
Right.
but they could not solve a problem with their gods. So I think it teaches us that God is sovereign over all, that he is all powerful. All right, at the Red Sea, God fought Egypt for Israel, and that was in chapter 14, verse 14. At Rephidim, however, God fights Amalek through Israel, and that's in chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, which we just read. That was the battle with Amalek. What might these two types of physical warfare illustrate for us concerning God's role and our role in the spiritual battles we face today? So, what do the two battles tell us about how we fight spiritual battles? What is God's role and what is our role in the spiritual battles we face today?
Well, God can defeat anything, and you can defeat it if you call on God to help you. You couldn't do it by yourself.
I think that probably
He's
is
just waiting for us to ask. What is it? There's that verse that says you do not have because you do not ask.
Mm-hmm.
so we agree God fights the battle, right? God's the one that does the fighting.
Well, I like I've heard there's a phrase I've always liked. It says, God's a gentleman. He's not going to come in until we ask. He's not going to just...
And that's the
a lot
second
of
part
times
of it.
he'll watch us fumble. He'll watch us fall on our face. And he's just waiting.
Yeah.
And then finally when we say, okay, God, okay, I've tried this on my own too many times. And, then
And see,
he
that's
comes
where
right
it
in.
comes to our role. God fights the battle. That's his role. That's what he does. He fights all spiritual battles. But we wage the war. We call on him for help. Yes. So he's the general and we're the soldiers.
There you go.
Yeah.
The last time Jethro and Zipporah were mentioned was in chapter 4, just before Moses returned to Egypt to begin the Exodus in Exodus chapter 4, verses 18 through 25. Why might the writer emphasize their presence here at the beginning of chapter 18? And in my parentheses, it's got, note that Moses' father-in-law is mentioned 8 times in the first 12 verses of chapter 18. Any ideas? Why might the writer emphasize the presence of his wife and children here at the beginning of the chapter?
To put Moses back down on the human level, that he is getting counsel from
His father-in-law.
his father-in-law
Yeah, that comes
with
later.
about his family, to let the people know that he is not the God. The God is there, and
So it's you think it's to make Moses more human than godlike.
yes, and the that he's
Keep him
getting
humble, maybe.
counsel. Yeah, getting counsel from another human instead of God. All of his instructions come from
I
God.
got to stress the passage of time, to emphasize how much time had passed since he had seen his wife, and all of the things that had taken place since didn't take
Right.
place overnight. It was many, many months.
Yes.
Okay. This next question, I will guarantee you I could not come up with an answer at all. So I really need y'all to listen up and help me answer this, because I just don't know. The narratives of Exodus 15, verse 22 through chapter 17, verse 7, portray Israel as generally faithless. Now remember, this is where they were complaining about this and that and everything else. Anyway, so despite being delivered by God from Egypt, what is ironic about the response of Jethro, who is introduced in chapter 18, verse 1, as the priest of Midian, to this same event, Exodus 18, 8 through 12. And then it says, for further insight, see Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 through 9, and Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, and Galatians chapter 3, 7. So, y'all keep in your mind that we're looking for irony between the events when after Jethro shows up and his response. Yep, and now we need to look some scriptures up. So I need Matthew 3, verses 7 through 9, and Romans 2, verses 28 and 29, and Galatians 3, verse 7. Catherine, you want to look up Galatians 3 for me?
Sure.
And Stephanie, are you looking for Matthew 3, 7 through 9?
I am.
Angie, could I get you to look up Romans 2, 28 and 29? It's just 2 verses.
You want me to go ahead and read it?
No, I
yeah.
think we need to do them in order.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one was Matthew 3.
Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 through 9.
But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, "Brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And therefore bear fruit and worthy of repentance. And do not think to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I say to you that God is able to raise up children to Abraham from those stones."
Okay, and Angie, would you mind reading Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29?
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
Jeez. 28, 27. Okay. There it is. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is it circumcision outward and physical. But a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God.
Okay, and then Galatians 3, 7, please, Catherine.
So you should know that the true children of Abraham are those who have faith.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I get out of those verses, and it doesn't seem to be ironic at all to me, but that children of the descendants of Abraham is not restricted to only the people born in his bloodline.
Right.
When Jesus died on the
with faith.
cross, it was also we all, when we accept Christ as our Savior, we all become children of God. These were the people of God, so in a way, we become the descendants of Abraham as well. But I don't find any irony in this, and this is what these chapters are talking, or these verses that we just read are talking about, how you can't be a Jew just because you prostrate yourself in public. You can't be a Jew just because you follow the law. You can't be a Jew just because you're circumcised. Okay? So that's what I'm getting from the verses that we read. But I don't see at all how it involves irony of Jethro's response, which was, "Blessed be the Lord, for He has brought you from the hands of Pharaoh." And then in the breakdown of he was actually forming a government at the end of this. You have judges of thousands and judges of hundreds and judges of 50 and judges of tens, but then you have the ultimate judgment of okay, I give up.
Yeah, I don't really see any irony.
Moses, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, I don't see irony in this at all. So I was hoping maybe somebody else could see it, but I don't see irony there at all.
I don't know, unless it's that the father-in-law was not a believer until he got the faith from seeing
He was the
what,
priest of Midian, and I don't know exactly what the priest of Midian means. It entails,
right?
I really don't know. So.
That would be the only ironic thing I would think is if
And it might be that
was-
he understood better than even the God's chosen people,
right?
who to bless and who to worship, and as they did do the sacrifices and the feast, which the sacrifices were to the Lord. So perhaps that is the irony. Thank you very much. Okay, so in Exodus chapter 18, verses 13 through 22, Jethro gives Moses advice for how to assign leadership responsibilities over Israel. According to verse 23, what ultimately undergirds the success of Moses' leadership strategy? If you would, please read verse 23, Stephanie.
If you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their place in peace.
Okay, so what ultimately, and I don't understand undergirds either. That term just doesn't come to mind. So if someone knows a better way to say that, I would appreciate it. So what ultimately makes the success of Moses' leadership strategy?
Well, he's actually teaching Moses, or maybe he's given him something that he knows, but Moses hasn't learned yet. I don't know.
So it is actually his father-in-law who is making Moses' leadership strategy here.
Right.
Is that a good way to say it?
That's why we need to be open as God's people to be teachable. We always, oh, I've got this. No. There's other people that are more qualified. We need to be humble in our ability to receive teaching and guidance from others.
Well, my answer involved the strategy. When you have leaders of smaller groups to handle the smaller problems, then that leaves more time for larger groups to handle larger problems, which leaves more time for the top to deal with the extreme.
That's sort of like what Moses did, or what God told Moses was, hey, these people are going to wear you out if you're having a
That's what Jethro told Moses, exactly, yes. So then it said, what does this imply for leaders of God's people today?
Not to take on too much, to give the
Split responsibility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's
Spread the responsibility out.
I think it's also very important to get people with different gifts. So you have like a really good cohesive, because this may be a detail person over here, but this person's a big picture person. If you have a bunch of big picture people running around,
if you have a bunch of big picture people, you don't have detailed people. So the details go unnoticed.
Oh,
yeah.
So yeah.
I also put it's kind of like the military or the court system. You know.
It says here that undergirth means to secure or fasten from the underside, especially by a rope or chain passed underneath. Provide support or a firm basis.
Wish that fly would get off my camera lens. Thank you. Okay, so that's the end of our question and answer session. So if y'all have the time and want to, I'll read through the gospel glimpses, the whole Bible connections, and the theological soundings. And then that will leave the personal implications for y'all to do on your own. Okay? So we have gospel glimpses, and this is bread from heaven. Not long after expressing fear over the approaching Egyptian army and experiencing God's powerful salvation in Exodus chapter 14, the Israelites grumble that they have no food in Exodus 16 verses 2 and 3. As he did previously, here again God graciously responds to their concerns and declares that he will rain bread from heaven for you in chapter 16 verse 4. God provided this heavenly bread, or manna, for the entirety of Israel's wilderness wanderings to sustain them throughout their travels. Chapter 16 verse 35. Similarly, when Jesus was faced with 5,000 hungry followers, he also fed them with miraculous bread. And that's found in John chapter 6, verses 1 through 14. He then went on to identify himself as the living bread that has come down from heaven in verse 51 of Exodus. Jesus notes that though Israel was sustained by the manna in the wilderness, eventually they all died. I take that back. That verse 51 is in John, I think. Eventually they all died. However, those who feed upon Jesus, the living bread from heaven, will live forever. And that's verse 58. And those are in John when the accounting of the feeding the 5,000. There's one in John, there's one in another one as well, and then there's one of a feeding of 3,000. But, and then water from the rock. Immediately after God provides this bread from heaven, The Israelites quarrel with Moses and complain that they have no water to drink. In response, God tells Moses to strike a rock out of which water pours for the people to drink. And that's in Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. Paul sees this episode a foreshadowing of Jesus' work, saying that all Israel drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. That's found in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4. Indeed, although the water from this rock quenched Israel's physical thirst, it pointed to the only fount that could quench their spiritual thirst, God Himself. Similarly, when passing through Samaria, Jesus told a Samaritan woman that the waters from Jacob's well would satisfy her physical thirst for a while, but that the living water He gives results in eternal life, quenching spiritual thirst forever. That's found in John chapter 4, verse 10 and verse 14. Though there may be some of you that are familiar with when He took a break there at Jacob's well when He was traveling in Samaria. His disciples didn't want Him to go that way, and He insisted, and then He sent them off to find food, and along comes the water for the woman for a well. The conversation that took place there. So the whole Bible connections. The Sabbath. When God instructs Israel how to gather the manna, He tells them to gather 2 days' worth on the 6th day of the week, so that they can honor Him by resting on the 7th day. That's Exodus 16, 22 through 30. Although this passage contains the first occurrence of the word Sabbath in Scripture, verse 23, the concept is first presented in creation when God rested on the 7th day, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. This divine rest in creation is later given as the grounds for Israel to rest from all their labors on the Sabbath. That's in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, and we'll get to those, I think, next week. In the New Testament, when Jesus is questioned about His actions on the 7th day, He declares that He is Lord of the Sabbath. And that's Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. And the writer of Hebrews says that those who trust in Him enter God's Sabbath rest in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 3 and 4. The testing. In these chapters, the theme of testing appears several times. When providing both sweet water and manna, God states that He is testing Israel to see if they will obey His word. That's in Exodus chapter 15, verses 25 through 26, and chapter 16, verse 4. However, rather than respond faithfully to God, Israel immediately quarrels with Moses and puts God to the test in chapter 17, verse 2 and verse 7. Psalms 95 interprets this latter resting as stemming from Israel's hard heart. Psalms 95, 8 and 9. And the writer of Hebrews uses this psalm to exhort his readers not to have an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God, and that's Hebrews 3:12. Those scriptures, those last three scriptures that I mentioned, were all dealing with the hardening of the heart, with Israel having a hard heart, and with this leading to your downfall or your falling away from God. Spiritual leadership. Jethro advises Moses to select men who fear God, who are trustworthy, and hate a bribe, and that's what they're talking about, covetousness, to help govern the people. Exodus chapter 8, verse 21. These qualifications for leadership are fundamentally concerned with spiritual maturity rather than personal charisma or dynamic ability. Such spiritual requirements for leadership are later reflected in Israel's law of the king, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 14 through 20, and Paul's instructions for elders and deacons in 1 Timothy 3, verses 1 through 13. Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. In short, in order to be a good leader of God's people, one must first be a good follower of God himself. And I've often wondered if we didn't take this same qualifications to our voting booth, we might come out with some, if everyone would, we would come out with some better leaders.
Amen.
But as everyone does not follow, and so many, it's becoming so few of us that do actually follow God's leadership. So it's really tough. But I think this is also just a sign of the end times, when people just will not fall to their knees. So, theological soundings. Providence. A pervading theme throughout these chapters is God's providence. Providence simply refers to God governing his people and providing for their needs. In this section, God provides his people with sweet water, Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 through 27, bread from heaven, chapter 16, verses 1 through 36, and water from the rock, chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. His providence is also evident in Israel's supernatural defeat of Amalek, chapter 17, verses 8 through 16, and in Jethro's encounter with Moses, in which past provisions of deliverance is recalled in chapter 18, verses 1 through 12, and future provision of leadership is arranged in chapter 18, verses 13 through 27. Israel's sinful grumbling, those are found in chapter 15, verse 4, chapter 16, verses 2 and 3, chapter 17, verse 3. This highlights the gracious nature of God's providence. He does not provide for his people because they are faithful, but because he is faithful. Sin. This section also emphasizes Israel's sinfulness and rebellion. Does that not exactly sound like people today? God's people repeatedly grumble against Moses. That's found in chapter 15, verse 24, chapter 16, 2 and 3, and chapter 17, verse 3. And even twice accuse him of seeking to kill them. Chapter 16, verse 3, and chapter 17, verse 3. In both of these latter instances, the people's rebellion against Moses is interpreted as an affront against God himself. Chapter 16, verses 7 and 8, and chapter 17, verse 2. Furthermore, Israel's disobedience to God's commands through Moses is mentioned twice in the account of the manna. Chapter 16, verse 20, and then verses 27 through 29. And their general lack of faith after the Red Sea deliverance stands in sharp contrast to Jethro's praise of God's supreme power based on the same event. Chapter 18, verses 9 through 12. These various elements combine to portray Israel as wholly sinful and unholy recipients of God's favor.
Unworthy.
Unworthy, yes. Holy, sinful, and unworthy. I said another word, didn't I?
No,
I'm sorry. Forgive me.
it's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
And then we have the personal implications, which I did answer them when I was doing this study. I usually don't, but I did this time, all but the last one. But those are things for you to write down and discern for yourself. Because it's what each person and where they're at in their walk with God is how it applies to you.
Right.
So, let me mark my Bible so I'll know where we are.
Yes,
Oh.
ma'am. Thank you so much.
So that concludes our lesson today. We hope you will come back and join us next week. We will be here next week, ladies.
Yeah.
Okay, we got nothing going on, so we will be meeting next week. Thank you so much for joining us.